Essa é a apresentação que foi feita na Sociedade sobre reconhecimento intersubjetivo e educação bilíngue, parte do meu projeto de pesquisa na Universidade Católica de Eichstätt-Ingolstadt. Por exigência da universidade, minha apresentação deverá ser feita em inglês. Durante o evento, o debate e a interação com os colegas foi feita em português. Good afternoon. My name is Marcelo Bacarin Costa. In the past few years, I have developed academic work at PUC Campinas exploring intersubjective recognition and intertwining it with bilingual education, which is my primary area of expertise. I'm here to present the current state of my PhD dissertation, which is being developed at the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt in Bavaria, Germany. My presentation will focus on interpersonal recognition, its origins, and its current theoreticians, its implications in education, bilingualism and bilingual education, some of my past research findings, and considerations regarding justice and bilingual education. So let's start with the question, what is intersubjective recognition? Intersubjective recognition is when a subject, that is a person, gradually becomes able to recognize another person's intersubjectivity, developing tolerance of others, appreciation of differences, empathy, and attunement. Axel Honneth, in 1995, states that intersubjective recognition is a driving force for the development of an ethical community. Both Honneth and Charles Taylor agree that identities are built in intersubjectivity, and they are key to self-realization. And they both also point out that subjects are in constant struggles for mutual recognition. Nancy Fraser, who also developed significant work on recognition, stresses the importance of redistributing material resources. She also points out that there is no justice without redistribution, and here she's somewhat acid and accuses Honneth of neglecting this aspect. Now, how did all this come about? I will here mention some of the milestones and thinkers that influenced intersubjective recognition. Prior to the Age of Enlightenment, the collapse of social hierarchies based on the concept of honor was substituted by a more egalitarian idea of dignity, or the more egalitarian idea of dignity. The idea of authenticity, becoming true to oneself, which leads to Rousseau's Le sentiment de l'existence, closely associated with what today we call identity. Hegel points out our social nature, and he dismisses the possibility of individualistic, independent identity formation. So here we paraphrase him saying that being human is being social. Identity formation presupposes intersubjectivity. Finally, we go to George Herbert Mead, who gives Hegel's theory of a struggle for recognition a materialist reformulation. He defines the stages of an individual's social development. To quote Honneth's words here, what re-emerged in Mead in the altered form of an empirical hypothesis was not only the general premise of the early Hegel that practical identity formation presupposes intersubjective recognition, but also post-metaphysical naturalistic equivalents for the concept distinctions among various stages of recognition, and even the wide-reaching association of a struggle mediating between these stages. Honneth describes the pattern of intersubjective recognition. Recognition at the level of love is the basis of the individual's moral formation, developed in the relationship with a baby's caregiver. In the process of healthy maturation, love produces self-confidence. A healthy establishment of the pattern of love gives the subject the effective foundations to progress to the second stage, which Honneth calls the patterns of rights, or legal moral patterns. At this level, recognition means providing human beings with equal opportunities. Once rights are ensured, the subject develops self-respect. It may be worth mentioning that recognition works in two directions. When dealing with rights, Honneth states that we can only understand ourselves as deserving of rights when we recognize the others as also deserving. Well, finally, there's the pattern of solidarity, a horizon of shared values that can determine the contributions that each individual and their qualities can bring to life of the other. Now, rather than equal opportunities, we want to create opportunities for differentiation, where each person finds their own place in history. Solidarity produces self-esteem. And what happens when intersubjective recognition does not take place? When there is non-recognition or misrecognition? As Taylor puts it quite assertively, non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm, can be a form of oppression, imprisoning someone in a false, distorted, and reduced mode of being. Misrecognition shows not just a lack of due respect, it can inflict a grievous wound, saddling its victims with a crippling self-hatred. Due recognition is not just a courtesy we owe people, it's a vital human need. Honneth also coins the term counterculture of compensatory respect. Here he says that excluded and marginalized individuals who use the resource of uniting themselves in groups. This phenomenon, typical of adolescence, commonly extends into adulthood and as a consequence of still deficient self-respect and self-esteem. I will now briefly mention the discussion taking place regarding intersubjective recognition and education, and I will say ahead of time that if we consider the wealth in the philosophical debate on recognition, there is still a lot to be produced linking education and education. Linking recognition and education. So at this point, I dare say that the correlations are still underexplored. Having said that, we must mention that in his best-known work, Struggle for Recognition, The Grammar Moral of Social Conflicts, in 1992, Honneth proposes the thesis of the precedence of primacy of recognition over knowledge. In this thesis, Honneth fundamentally differentiates the two processes by explaining that recognizing is a practical and not an epistemic attitude, and that therefore it relates to the social rather than the individual processes of realization at the mental level. I will come back to this point in 2 slides when I present findings of some research I carried out in 2020. Well, let's change the topic of our conversation here and ask, what is bilingualism? Bilingualism. There's a lot to be said about bilingualism and bilingual education, which we won't, for reasons of time, do here. However, I will quickly attempt to answer the question, what is bilingualism, by saying that non-native-like proficiency, there is actually a spectrum that gives all the way, bilingualism is not native-like proficiency in 2 languages. There is actually a spectrum that goes all the way from this level of proficiency to anyone who can operate minimally with any skill in a foreign language. As McNamara states, I have drawn up my definition, or rather a list of criteria that would define what bilingual is in my own understanding. and these criteria positions itself more or less in the middle of this spectrum I have just mentioned. A bilingual is someone who, in two languages, can generate little effort to understand and to be understood, transact with low levels of anxiety, use appropriate language, interact with oral and written text produced for his age and knowledge, produce acceptable grammar and syntax. And then we follow on to deal with the term translanguaging, which has been very well explored by Ofelia Garcia. Further down the line, translanguaging was initially used to refer to pedagogical practices in both languages in bilingual education, in bilingual classrooms. Garcia in 2009 redefined it as multiple forms of discursive practice through which the bilingual individual tries to make sense of and understand the context related to each of the languages. Translanguaging is thus the use of two or more languages by a single individual in an attempt to make sense of the world and the discursive universe that is presented in front of them. More than a form of language, it is a practice which adapts to the interlocution that is placed before the subject. In this process, the borders between languages lose clarity and are constantly crossed in search of more adequate expressive resources. This definition differs from the idealized view of an individual who masters two distinct systems, or an individual who is equivalent to two monolinguals. In 2020, I carried out some empirical research with a group of pre-adolescents around the world, whose main instrument was semi-structured online interviews. The process and findings were laid down on approximately 130 pages. I just want to briefly quote myself here and illustrate two of the very significant conclusions we came to. So, in this piece of empirical research, we established that in the interviews carried out with participants in the transition ages from childhood to adolescence, from primary to secondary education, from 9 to 12 years old, a significant influence of factors related to intersubjective recognition in the school environment was revealed. An influence smaller, but present in the family and community spheres. When individuals are recognized for their ability to operate in different languages, they generally form a self-perception that they are competent in these languages and come to understand themselves as a person with broader possibilities of communication and thinking. Intersubjective recognition, especially in the school environment, is presented as a variable of considerable value in the establishment of self-perception, consequences of self-confidence and self-respect of bilingual competence. Now let me make a few considerations regarding justice within the realm of bilingual education. Here I will ask for your understanding that my readings and research are still in its early stages. Therefore, the points raised herein are investigation paths rather than conclusions. We have established that intersubjective recognition is a very important element to be taken into account in education, and that bilingual education, as part of the educational process, have much to benefit from it. In these last minutes, I will make some considerations about why bilingual education is a matter of justice and may enhance citizenship and democracy. First of all, bilingual education may be part of a quest for opportunities, a competitive edge, so employment, scientific participation, diplomacy, international politics. This is the case of Brazil, and it's also the case of many private schools around the world. We may label this factor as promoting competitiveness and indiscriminate meritocracy. However, it can only be countered by widespread investments in public bilingual education. the urgency of integrating and dignifying immigrants. Several European countries in the USA and other areas attract a sizable number of immigrants, but in reality, an insurgency in pockets of immigration is taking place across the globe. Integrative, diverse speech communities. In countries such as Paraguay, Singapore, and South Africa, and in the cases of deaf persons and indigenous communities, bilingual education can only help foster mutual understanding, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and the promotion of human rights. To give you a glimpse of the current issues regarding justice and education in Germany, Stoyanov advocates that the key issue that determines justice in education is not what you have, but how you are treated. Suggesting that more resources should be allocated to the education of immigrants than to the average German, he further states that perhaps we should not aim at equality of education, but rather at the adequacy of education. That is, an education which will allow the learners, will allow them to live with dignity, participate fully in their community. All things said, I wish to close this presentation by stating that humankind developed in a world without borders and fluid multilingualism. At a certain point in history, we were herded into nation states and made to use and cherish a national language to the detriment of others. It seems reasonable to think that, despite forces otherwise, we're moving back into a plural world of faint national borders and bilingual enunciation spaces. This makes a case for intersubjective recognition as a cause and consequence of bilingual education, as part of the provision of dignity and full participation in a democratic society. Here follow my references, my main references, obviously. And I would like to thank you all, yes, in 3 different languages. I would like to make a special thanks to Dr. Arthur Renda Vitorino from PUC Campinas and Dr. Krasimir Stoyanov from the Catholic University of Eichstätt, Ingolstadt in Germany, both of whom have been or is my advisor at the moment. You may contact me through the email which is shown in the screen below. Thank you very much.